something we always learn about. You always hear about when you discuss the Constitution. The United States, namely any Western power, is a balancing of powers. Now, there are different fomentations of where that comes from, but one of the most brilliant and extraordinary is Magna Carta. Magna Carta, it's a brilliant document from the 13th century. King John, I'm sure many of you have heard the tale of Robin Hood, an amazing man who comes and he steals from the rich, gives to the poor. Well, that King John is real, and he caused horrible turmoil in England in the 13th century. But he led England into mass amounts of war, into strife, into debt. Basically, everyone came together and said, how can we curtail his power? How can we balance his power? And they came up with this idea, and they wrote it down because there's something remarkable about putting something in writing. Magna Carta put a limitation on the king. Something like that has hardly existed throughout any time in history ever. And it was written down in word in the early 13th century in England. And that document is the cornerstone for the Constitution, for the United Kingdom and the United States. That document provided ways to not only limit the king, almost impeach the king, so to speak. What sort of milestone does Magna Carta represent? The first limitation of any executive power foments the basis of a multi-pronged governance, and it ensures rights. It doesn't go to the lengths that the United States Constitution will. Again, this precedes the Constitution by over 500 years, but it's an evolutionary document in that it limits what will later be coined the executive. It limits that, and it took a lot of bravery to be able to do that. You also need to have some money and power to be able to do that. There's another group of philosophers that have a monumental impact on the debates that took place at the Continental Congress. We talked about a king. In certain cultures, divinely anointed power and executive power. There's a brilliant philosopher, Hobbes. Hobbes came up with this great quote, I'm sure many of you know, or you ought to know, in his work, The Leviathan, that life is nasty, brutish, and short. Well, he clearly was not an optimist. Hobbes believed human beings are not inherently so good. There's a darkness to us. We can't be trusted to govern ourselves. That will devolve into anarchy, into corruption. Hobbes discusses how a strong executive, he actually uses the term of the monarch, is the best form of governance, because that person can do the utmost good, ought to be the utmost educated, and can govern effectively without a splintered government. Then there's sort of the Lockean interpretation. Locke discusses natural rights, what we are in nature, how we do have to come together and form a government, because nature can be brutish. I won't say it always is. And Locke discusses that, but he says the best way for us to live is to come together and form our own government, and that there is a balancing, and having an ever strong, effective monarch can lead to absolute evil as well, because they're human as well. So there's this tussle of what's the most effective form of government because of human nature, whether or not humans are bad and nature is bad, or they're benign, or they're benevolent. So this argument, it's at the very foundation of the creation of the United States. Washington, he could have been a king very easily, but he believed in ideals. He believed in things like a balancing of powers, like the Magna Carta, that there was a good way to run one's life and to run a government, and that a government ought to be built by the people, and ought to be ran by the people, and it ought to be for the people. And he believed that, and he was able to give up the crown and walk away back to Mount Vernon, something that so few people in history have ever been able to do.